Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization. My name is Natalia Shpulova-Said, and thank you for attending our talk. Today, we have the opportunity of speaking with the editor and contributors of Contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic Art, Political and Social Perspectives, 1991-2021, the book which was published by ibidem-Verlag in 2021. So we have the opportunity of speaking with Svitlana Biedarieva, the editor of this volume, Kateryna Botanova, Lia Doslima, Andrii Dostliev, and Jessica Zychowicz. And at this point, let me just mention a few words about our speakers. Svitlana Biedarieva is an art historian and curator with a focus on Eastern European and Latin American art. She holds her PhD in History of Art from the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London. Hello, Svitlana. Lia Dostlieva is an artist, cultural anthropologist, and essayist. Primary areas of her research are trauma, post-memory, and agency of vulnerable groups. She works in a wide range of media, including photography, installations, and textile sculptures. Her works were exhibited in Germany, Italy, Ukraine, Poland, Austria, and Czech Republic, to name but a few. Hello, Lia. Andrii Dostliev is an artist, curator, and photography researcher from Ukraine, currently based in Poland. His primary areas of interest are memory, trauma, and identity, both personal and collective, and limits of photography as a medium. Recent solo exhibitions include Black on Prussian Blue, Shcherbenko Arts Center, Kiev, Ukraine, 2021, Black Raven Sang the Water, Kiev, Ukraine, 2021, and I Still Feel Sorry When I Throw Away Food. Grandma used to tell me stories about the Holodomor, Odessa National Art Museum, 2021 and 2022. He also published several photo books. Hello, Andrii.
Hello.
And Kateryna Botanova is a Ukrainian cultural critic, curator, and writer based in Basel. She is a co-curator of UkrSO, Swiss multidisciplinary biennial, and she is an editor of the critical anthologies that accompany each festival, among them On the Edge, UkrSO 2019, Poland, Archaeology of the Future, UkrSO 2017, Greece, and UkrSO 2021. She's also a member of PEN Ukraine, and she publishes widely on art and culture. And hello, Kateryna. And we have one more participant, Jessica Zychowicz, but I hope she will join us in a couple of minutes. But at this point, I think we can proceed to our presentation. We'll start with our speakers. Each speaker will have 15 minutes or so to present on their piece. And after that, we'll proceed to our Q&A session. But please submit your comments and your questions during our brief presentations. Svitlana, I guess we'll start with your talk.
Okay, hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Natalia, so much for this invitation to make this book launch with Ukrainian organization at the Indiana University. I'm really delighted to present today this book. And I would like to have some few words about the contents and the general orientation of this book, and as well as about my text for this book. So I would like to thank all the contributors, all and curators and art historians who wrote their text focused on Baltic and Ukrainian art of the last 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And they touched upon a variety of aspects that both unite and divide the art scenes in Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, respectively. There was some kind of an interesting perspective of how to see Ukrainian and Baltic art through the same lens and through the comparative perspective. So I'm quite proud to say that this volume is the first publication of book length on this topic, and that looks both through the historical lens as well as the addresses contemporary issues in art of Baltic and Ukrainian, Baltic countries and Ukraine. And the main orientation of this book is to contribute to comparative art history, which is, I can say that currently is not that much developed. There are really few publications in general globally about comparative approach in difference to literature, in difference to politics, in difference to history. Art history really doesn't produce many texts on this topic. And it is important to say that also for me as an art historian, it was interesting to take this angle in order to put Ukraine into some kind of global art history, to find a niche for it. So this is the book. I'm really happy to present it. And I think I can start my small PowerPoint to speak already in detail about different aspects of this book. So many thanks to the series editor Andrii Sumland, who invited me to gather this volume. And when we discussed with him this volume, actually, first it was to be published in the series by ibidem Press, which is called Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society, which is a large series. But then we resaw this paradigm, and particularly I propose that actually we shouldn't look at Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania through this lens of belonging to the post-Soviet space, because the scholarship that is already emerged to date allows taking kind of forward all this paradigms that links to the common Soviet past. And we can speak about such approaches as Pyotr Petrovsky's idea of horizontal art history, for example, that denies the relations between centers as peripheries as definitive for art production, but instead proposes that every local, every region or every country locally produces its own art in relation to the local context, and by this context is already valuable. Another idea is by cultural anthropologist Eva Domanska, who proposes a notion of affirmative humanities, that speaking about traumas, speaking about the past, we shouldn't focus on this destructive point of view of all this traumatic notion. However, we need to take from the past the constructive elements and then already in the contemporary studies reconstruct them, and in this way reconstruct the cultural studies. And there is a variety of approaches that I can talk about, but all of these notions informed the idea of this book. I'm very thankful to the contributors. I will briefly speak about some of the texts. Eva Stachowska, Eva Stachowska wrote a text about mapping transformations in Latvian and Baltic art after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, how this socialist informed society was converting to the society of capitalism, and how this transfer was reflected in Latvian and Baltic art. My own text was focusing on the documentary turn in Ukrainian art, but I will talk about it a little bit later. Kateryna Botanova, I'm sure today will speak about her brilliant text, Artist as a Virus, Political Transformations and Art in Ukraine after 1991. And I really look forward to hear her presentation. Elena Martinyuk spoke about the period of transfer between the late perestroika and early 90s, and how artists perceived this period as a situation of both fear and hope of changes. and how this was reflected. Lina Michalkiewicz and Vytautas Michalkiewicz spoke about artist collecting as alternative to the governmental policy of collecting, and the ways artists interpret preservation of heritage and preservation of their own contemporary works in different ways that quite differ from from usual museum-based approach. Margaret Tully spoke about difficult histories and memory in Baltic art, particularly the memory of the Second World War and the memory of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And she looked at how artists in the last decades interpret these notions. Jessica Zychowicz spoke about feminism in Ukrainian art and the artistic representation of topics of gender identity as political identity in Kiev. So I would like to say a couple of words about my own text, if I still have time. I spoke about the documentary turn in contemporary art with the beginning of the war of Russia in Ukraine, and the necessity by the artist to document the ever-changing reality and the traumatic reality, because new material was emerging, so the artists needed to create their own archives at the times, and to document all these violent and turbulent events that were occurring in the country. In the east of the country, in Crimea, and generally these processes fostered the development of the documentary approach in Ukrainian art. This is the main hypothesis of my text. About the notion of documentary art. It is proposed by us and developed by such curators and artists as and researchers as Uku Envezor, Hito Steyer, and among many others. Erika Balsam, for example, is a researcher of cinema who applies the notion of documentary art in research of film. So it's an art that is an intersection between documentary and artistic practices. So Hito Steyer and Maria Lin say that documentary art is a form that emerges in a state of crisis and often aims to mirror the effects of past or recent political or economic upheaval. Olivier Le Gon proposes that documentary is often taken as antonym to artistic, yet it stems primarily from the artistic field, beyond art, yet very much a part of it. Erika Balsam and Hila Peleg propose that the documentary turn has emerged as a response to the post-colonial transformation, where the artists turn their gaze from the centrally produced body of ideas to the diverse world beyond its limits. And if in European and Western art in general, this documentary turn occurred in the early 2000s, we can say that in Ukraine, precisely this transformation was pushed by the post-colonial, the actualization of this post-colonial situation that appeared with the events starting from 2014. And as a necessity to challenge this colonial perspective. Speaking about colonial and post-colonial, I would like to mention some of Ukrainian and international researchers who speak about Ukraine and its position in this paradigm. Vitaly Chernetsky calls Ukraine post-colonial in the Second World, arguing that Ukrainian culture reflects both the post-socialist version of the postmodern condition and the crisis of Russian colonialism. Miroslav Andrii points out that the post-colonial discourse not directly opposes the once dominating narrative, but through a variety of discursive strategies, synthesizes a new vision of the elements of the past that can be used in the present and the future. So basically, it intersects also with this idea of Eva Domanska that I mentioned, that of taking constructive elements from the traumatic moments and reestablishing, reforming them in the contemporaneity. Homi Baba has proposed that political and social otherness rely upon an ambivalent discourse on colonization, presenting it simultaneously as an object of desire and derision, and articulation of different content within the fantasy of origin and identity. And what I propose is that documentary art actually challenges this coloniality and challenges the very paradigm of colonial and post-colonial, because it subverts this ambivalent discourse by documentation. And so does actually the work with archives, with the direct documents of the past that doesn't allow this double reading at some points. And so some of the works that I mentioned in my text, there are the works, projects by Andrii Boyarov, who is Estonian Ukrainian artist, as he hasn't presented him in this book, but also actually he works in Poland, so he's truly international artist in that way. And he works with art of appropriation. In the project Copy Past, Boyarov presents a number of works by Polish photographers who were connected to Ukraine in some way, or who lived in Lviv before the war, before the Second World War. And he highlights and recontextualizes their works by placing them in his own exhibition as a curatorial project, in order to challenge this discrepancy between the contemporaneity and the past. In his other work, site-specific, Andrii Boyarov uses found film found photographs that he found as a film in a roll in the streets of Tallinn. And he doesn't know the origin of these works, but he presents this works by the unknown photographer, to the public, both in Estonia and in Ukraine. And by this section, he challenges the perceptions of the past and all the similarities or differences that we can see in perception of the audience of these works, and the kind of some private moments of the past that he uses to trigger this emotion in the viewers. Another project that relates to the creation of archive and also the use of the archive is quite provocative project by Mykola Ridney, just called Armed Dangerous, and he invited several film directors and artists to present videos related to the militarization of Ukrainian society following the war the beginning of the war in 2014. And different videos follow different aspects, but I would like to focus on the video of Peter Arminovsky, who interviewed several children in Slavyansk, which was once occupied by a Russian army and then liberated by Ukrainian army. And he explores these traces of violence as they appear in the children games. All the children who play with guns and even sometimes real knives, and they just consider it a game. But basically, it echoes the violence that they witnessed just a few years before this. And another video in the same project is Alexei Radinsky, who uses the 1990s recordings from the archives in Stanitsa Luganskaya in Donbass region of in initiation to the army of local youth, and the way how all this rite of initiation follows rather grotesque interpretation of some kind of rituals related to Don Cossacks, for example, all this kind of very Russian related fabricated culture, and also these rites, they follow this idea of orthodoxy, and in a way they present some certain syncretism that can explain also the outburst of violence in the given region, in terms of all this contested history and contested memory. Another example is a project by Ola Mikhailuk, who interviewed those women who needed to run from Luhansk Oblast without burst of war, and she collected their stories. And then in a 2-channel video, she presented first interviews in a type of seminar that she created with them. And in another video, she recreated a walk that one of the women who was a single mother needed to do, walking in the snow, escaping from shelling in her hometown. And also, this project involves documentation both in Russian and Ukrainian of all these personal stories with these women who suffered from this military violence. And the last project I want to talk about is the project of Evgenia Belarusets, Victories of the Defeated, who represented the stories of miners in the mining towns in the age of in the borderline of with the occupied territories, and she did a particular focus on female histories and the routine life, the ways how it was affected or unaffected by the war with Russia. And in this part, I would like to stop speaking about my text and return to the book. And I just want to say that one of the important things that I want to say is that the attempts actually to compare Ukrainian and Baltic art, they are at their initial stage. And for example, as a reader will not find any text that would be comparing Ukrainian, Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian, for the simple reason that there is no such researcher that I could find to work on this text. So this is subject to the further research. Another point is that another point is that I think this text also will contribute to Ukrainian studies, because there are really few texts on contemporary Ukrainian art in a paper published in English and Ukrainian studies. And the situation in Baltic art is a little bit better, but I think and I hope that this text will do some kind of good contribution to both. What I want to say at the end, that with the current tension in the border of Ukraine and all this political and social pressures that everybody related to Ukraine experiences, I hope this text also will be kind of, like a sign of collaboration, a sign of solidarity, that actually Ukraine and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania experience many similar problems related to their memory and their traumas, and this keeps affecting also until today. So I hope that with culture and with a focus on culture, we can somehow overcome some of the threats of contemporary situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Svitlana, and I think we can proceed to our next presenter, Lia Doslima.
So I thought it was the last one.
Oh, well, I have I have my list of speakers, so maybe it's not Lia then.
Sorry, I think it was Jessica and then Kateryna and then Lia and then Andrii.
Okay, sorry, I had a different list of speakers, but that's fine. And Jessica, I'm very happy. Jessica joined us. And let me introduce Jessica at this point then. Jessica Zychowicz is the director of Fulbright Ukraine and Institute of International Education, Kyiv office. In 2020, she published her monograph, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine, published by University of Toronto Press. Jessica Zychowicz has authored numerous articles on gender, human rights, revolution, and protest in post-communism. She's a board member of the Association for Women in Slavic Studies and advisory board member of H Ukraine, and is a founding co-editor of the Forum for Race and Post-Colonialism at Kritika.com. Hello, Jessica.
Hello, Natalia and colleagues. I recognize many names also in the audience. It's wonderful to be among friends and fellow supporters of Ukraine at such a difficult time. I'm in Warsaw, and on my way here to where I'm presenting from, my Airbnb, I was in a taxi, and the taxi driver was from Azerbaijan. He told me his name was Azerbaijani, but he spoke perfect Ukrainian. And I asked him where he learned Ukrainian, and he told me he's from Severodonetsk and his family is there, and he's working in Warsaw and will go back to Severodonetsk next week to be with his family because they're worried about the situation. And he let me know that his daughter is an art historian and is working with some of the very initiatives that I have engaged with and written about in this paper. So the world is very small, and the art that is produced at the front line, as Svitlana Biedariev's exhibit, through which I got to know her over the past couple of years, shows us this work has global resonance. And when I contributed my piece to this anthology, which Svitlana kindly invited me to be a part of, and I'm so honored to be a part of, I was amazed already at her global perspective of Ukraine. She's working from Mexico City, did an exhibit there about Donbass that brought scholars from Mexico City into conversation, meaningful conversations about experiences on the other side of the globe. And I was able, with Svitlana, to work to bring that exhibit to Canada, to Winnipeg. And that received some support, I know very minimal, but it matters, from Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. My dream would be to see more of the visual works that Svitlana has showcased in Mexico and Canada go to the US. So hopefully we'll see that happen. And I think this anthology, what it is doing for critical thinking about Ukraine is not only art, but more than art, as some of the artists we engage with like to say. They are working themselves oftentimes as anthropologists and activists. In my piece, I'll get to gender, because I feel that was my contribution to this volume, was looking at the aesthetics of the Women's March in Ukraine that takes place on March 8th. Which I have studied and studied as a participant of for several years since it began in 2011. And in my piece here, which I call A New Dawn at the Centennial of Suffragism, Artistic Representation in Trans-European and Transatlantic Kyiv, I'm trying to develop a language here which I think shares some intertextuality with the documentary turn that Svitlana is working with, both in the introduction to the volume and in her chapter. This impulse to document women's experience does not end at the march that takes place on March 8th, but it is a year-long conversation also about the meaning of the difficult heritage of the Soviet idea of of the woman's question and the designation of March 8 as International Women's Day, having, of course, different meaning in different countries, but one that still provides a critical lens on what suffragism is, the right to vote, as well as a host of other rights. In this piece, I focus on a couple of case studies of how visual aesthetics are positioned by demonstrators and activists to contest symbolic and political manipulations of the female body by the state, by legislation over abortion, which in the Polish context also has a very recent immediate history, and how symbols are used by different groups also in ways that have an impact on legislation in Ukraine with regard to the civil code that since Maidan has been connected to debates around anti-discrimination laws and also decommunization laws, that the public space of the Women's March since 2011, before Maidan, has become one that is ever more connected to wider debates throughout Ukraine that affect not only women, but everyone. What is also, I think, really important about the case studies that I'm looking at, not only the Women's March, but also I look at an exhibit that took place in 2019, November, called A Space of One's Own, that featured roughly 25 female artists going back to Olenka Petrenko, going all the way to the 90s and then into the present. So this was a retrospective of women's art around the question of suffragism that took place in Pinchuk Art Center, but was really organized by different grassroots groups, including former members of the feminist group Offensiva, which was seminal in the 2000s because they were the main organizers of the Women's March. That exhibit was really the inspiration for me to write this piece. And from that, I unfolded a couple of key cases, like the poster at the Women's March in 2018, March 8th, featuring a woman. I include the photo in my article, featuring a nude woman being kind of, poked with a trident and a hanger, clothing hanger, which later became the symbol of self-performed abortion in the Polish protests. This is a banner by artist Dana Kavalina, who's also done a lot of work with the UN and UN Women. So she's an established artist. But the poster in the march in 2018 was arrested, actually, and taken to court for breaking with Ukraine's civil codes. What was the reason it broke with the civil codes? Well, the trident supposedly was a state symbol being used in the context of a protest, which is not allowed in the civil code. So there was that pretext, but obviously a nude woman being, pulled in all these different directions. You could see the image in my book. It's a violent image. Had certainly offended people, not just for the use of the trident, but this was the pretext upon which it was arrested. The poster was acquitted. It was not a successful trial in the terms of those who took it on trial, which was these were members of the opposition to the march, which do make themselves visible every year at the march. It's a very politicized event, maybe unlike some marches, women's marches that I have attended in DC as well, against starting with the Trump regime, but also in other parts of the US where the experience is different. And it's I think important in my piece where I'm talking about trans-European and transatlantic, to see how things inform one another without trying to divide West ideas apart from Ukraine ideas, because they are intertwined not only in the recent experience of online social hashtag media like hashtag #MeToo movement coming after hashtag «Я не боюся сказати». That's only one example, but going back to 1920s, a lot of American women were traveling to the Soviet Union, talking to activists there. I cite that history and I try to look for moments where there's overlap or kind of gap in the way that we inherit the history of suffragism and women's rights on either side of the ocean, because I think we are taught to inherit our history of women's rights separately as two separately developing strands. One is Soviet and one is not Soviet, but it's not so simple that, before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, women were marching in St. Petersburg, and maybe, figures like Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg were clearly socialists, and many were arguing for ideas that were later, taken up in the Soviet experiment and Marx and Engels. But that's not the end all be all of women's history. And I think with this piece, I'm performing a gesture, kind of a call, a response actually to what women artists in Ukraine have been doing for the last 20 years and has, in my opinion, not received enough attention from American feminists, from Western feminists, as not a separate history, but part of our history too, that we need to reinvestigate our approach. So the last point, I guess, that I will make is that some of the artists, in addition to, I mentioned Dana Kavalina, but also Evgenia Belorusets, who Svitlana is writing about in her chapter, they appear throughout all of our work in this anthology. And that has been largely, I guess we could say, accidental, because we didn't have meetings in the writing process in which we told each other, you're going to write about this person and I'll write about it that way. It's because we are already a kind of milieu. And this anthology is the first in English to document that milieu. So it is also a manifestation of the documentary turn that Svitlana is mentioning. And I look forward to encountering what I hope will be many more critical pieces of writing, of scholarship about the visual material that is being analyzed in this volume. Because now, I think more than ever, with media and large capital P political narratives, we need artists, we need creative expression to tell stories that challenge easy categorization into East or West, or man and woman, or any number of ways of dividing and conquering people. That includes Russian versus Ukrainian, because as Svitlana just mentioned, this volume can also be seen and understood as solidarity, because we do cite moments in Russian history, and we recognize that people have at different points in time even changed their nationality based on survival strategies between Poland and Ukraine, or between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So this is all what I hope will just be an appetizer for you. And please, anybody who is interested in engaging and working with me or others here in this volume, contact us at any time. And I look forward to the next discussion section after our other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. So then I guess our next speaker will be Kateryna.
Yeah, I would also think so, that I'm the next speaker. Thank you, Natalia, for inviting me for this talk, and thank you, Svitlana, for this immense challenge that you created with this book, because the moment when you invited me to write, to contribute something, I was actually working on art on a different continent, but the idea or the chance that you presented with the book to look at Ukrainian art in really the time frame from the beginning of the independence period to nowadays somehow coincided with some writing and researches I've been doing before, within kind of the general interest and the general focus of the interconnectedness between political and political and social engaged art and transformations of the societies in general. What I would like to also kind of state in the beginning that I am not an academician, and in such kind of presentations I always stated, because I come from a different background, from a different milieu, as a practicing curator and a cultural critic. And another probably little moment is that because the time frame is so big, and I mean, now when I look back at the text and the ideas, I think that it was probably a very ambitious step to try to look at the 30 years. Maybe I should have been a bit more humble. But in any case, of course, the text itself is a certain way a sketch of a bigger research, and what I will be talking today now in this whatever 10-15 minutes is a sketch of a sketch. So I hope we can sort of agree on that. The text, the essay reviews the transformation of a notion of political, and that was kind of my main interest, the notion of political over the course of the 30 years in artistic practices and social relations. I suggest to look at this as a process of social emancipation manifested in the cycles of civic unrest, or as they're mostly known in Ukrainian history, revolutions, starting with 1991, which is not a revolution in itself, but which was preceded with the student revolution or the granite revolution. But of course, 1991 is the moment of change in itself. Then, of course, 2004, the Orange Revolution, and 2019, 13, 14, the Revolution of Dignity. These ones are chosen not just because they're the moments of major political changes, but rather as intense potentiality of reviewing the social contract, and thus understanding of the scope of meaning of political and its implications. In between them, we can trace the understanding of politics or political from the early 90s as a dirty business. Politics is a dirty business done by the post-Soviet apparatchiks or red directors and oligarchs. Then through the vision of politics as a process of reclaiming or reimagining one's national identity. Then political as a part of enlarging identity, as regaining subjectivity, as impersonal is political. And then finally now closer to where we are now in time and space, as a common space of governing cohabitation, inclusion and shared responsibility. However, what interests me most is to look at the role of artists, not as offsprings of political history, but in a way its instigators. I suggest tracing changing relations between Ukrainian political upheavals and different generations of artists, and the role of the artist as a virus that invades the system of social relations and provokes some unforeseeable changes, as was formulated some time ago by a philosopher, Elena Petrovskaya. This image of a virus, of course, is especially interesting after 2020. Actual virus that exists in the liminal space between the life and non-life. It can self-propagate, it can adapt, manipulate its environment as if it was actually a living being, although it's not. In a sort of similar way, an artist exists in the liminality of the non-political. And similarly to the current pandemic that redefines the gap between life and non-life, over the years, the artist's virus gradually redraws and rearticulates the gap between the political and the non-political, redefining the notion of political along its way. So the essay is structured along the 3 chapters, and I will very quickly try to follow this 3 chapters now. So early 90s, the non-political, political, end of perestroika, beginning of independence to the Orange Revolution, then personal as political, the time between the 2 revolutions, and the time after Euromaidan, politics as an act of inclusion and the action of the commons. So in the part of a non-political political art after 1991, I'm interested in challenging one of the main narratives about Ukrainian art in the 1990s, namely the fact that it was a vital, spectacular, and baroque, but totally apolitical. Seeing politics as ideological pressure and limitation of freedom, artists were persistently, even stubbornly, setting themselves against this politics. And it was precisely what kept them within the scope of political. While the artists articulated their positions beyond, their works were mirroring, mocking, and twisting political and social realities. They explored the potentiality of unknown scenarios and created multiple fictitious realities. This possibility of creating such alternative fictitious realities marked the language of art in the 90s with its articulation of fragility of the personal, physical, intimate side of the human being. This reclaiming the body and making the physicality and sexuality assertively present was an act of political emancipation, breaking free of the impersonal gray mass of the Soviet collective experience. These artists were creating their parallel alternative, often hyper-realistic worlds which de facto mirror the social reality of 90s, including the search for new identities, the attempts to formulate alternative histories, the attention to memory, the violent clash of extreme poverty and obscene wealth, and the extreme degree of powerlessness of this generation caught in between the milestones of change. In there, we can see the works of many artists from the Kiev squad Park Komuna, like Oleg Holosy or Alexander Militsky, but also the artists working with both source centers of contemporary art that existed at that time in Kiev, for example, Ilya Chichkan, and in Odessa, like the artistic duo of Kulchitsky-Chikorsky. Just to bring one example, I would name probably the artworks of Arsen Savadov in general, but in particular, of course, his photo series Donbass Chocolate, where the coal miners and actors covered with dust and sweat are posing naked in the female ballet costumes. This artificial tenderness of the ballet, sort of most iconic Soviet art form, is juxtaposed against the crude image of the miner, the hero of Soviet ideology. This ballet is elevated art, which is also known to be used during the political putches, like in 1991, stands next to the low, dirty brutality of the mining world. This creates an ironic kaleidoscope that combines the social vulnerability, repressed sexuality, homoerotism, and the fragility and sensitivity of human body that tries to emancipate from being an object to being a subject. Interesting, however, that it's in just a few years, Arsen Savadov has himself emancipated toward the group of artists that hijacked the very first Ukrainian pavilion in Venice Biennale in 2001. These tactics of personal emancipation joined in a collective political action where the artists, the group of artists, 9 of them, demanded from the Ministry of Culture to give back the symbolic and physical ownership of the non-existent Ukrainian pavilion. And of course, the ethical and legal issues I will not discuss now because it's a separate long story. But interesting that what came out of it was a wild climax of a travesty, mockery, physicality of present and fictitious reality, and at the same time, a reclaiming a kind of a group and national identity, because as we know, what happened is since no pavilion and no building, no space was available by the moment when the conflict around the Ukrainian pavilion was over, the artist brought a military tent and installed the military tent on the lawn of a giardini. And inside this tent was this collective diorama depicting, ironically, but also kind of quite sincerely, the pastoral life of a Ukrainian village with the image of Chernobyl further on the horizon. So that the travesty of social reality and subjectification through this renegotiating body politics was transitioning into a discussion of representation and identities, and reclaiming the political as individual emancipation created grounds for reflecting on and questioning the political as a collective action. What are the rules and limits of the communities? What kind of interactions are possible within them, as well between them? What and who are we as a society, as a still new formulated nation, going beyond the interest of a single individuals, and by this beyond the rule of the survival of the fittest? How to build a political nation capable of embracing multiple identities on the foundations of traumatic experience of the Soviet collectivity and post-Soviet aggressive individuality. These questions and many others bring us to 2004, to the month of the public protests that climaxed around Maidan and were called the Orange Revolution. It empowered the individual voices by a certain liberation from fear and managed to unite these voices into collective statement and individual fears into a carnival of a bodily liberation. The subsequent years of the President Yushchenko that were seen as the national revival through the search of roots and reclaiming history peculiarly went along the paradoxes and stereotypes of the national identity building that were already sketched by artists in the early 2000s. And I cannot mention it now because of time, but I a bit go over it in the essay. However, what I'm rather interested to see is how these searches for the new notion of collective body as a nation brought up the needs of negotiating and renegotiating positions of various groups of individuals, the attention to social interactions and the criticism of the institutional infrastructure. I cannot not mention, of course, that the key phenomenon of the time was the Rep group, revolutionary experimental space. And I will talk a bit more about them, not about the others, but only because they are a certain, in the best sense, blueprint to many initiatives and artistic actions that we're developing further on. They did become, in a way, a symbol of generation by creating a space for the community building and communication of other artistic groups and collectives. The Rep group was actively delinking themselves from the previous generation of artists through articulating their practices in openly political terms, stepping aside of producing arts as objects and actively engaging in polarized performativity of politics, and paradoxically enough, defining themselves as a distorted mirror of social reality, something which the previous generation did, but didn't mention, didn't say. The Rep community from the very beginning reached beyond the circle of closest friends, the milieu that limited the work of the previous generation. Participation in the political process in protests where people of different experience, knowledge backgrounds, and professional perspectives interacted, put these artists in a significantly more public situation than ever before. This different situation entailed opening up previously somewhat hermetic artistic discourse to philosophers, anthropologists, cultural critics, and human rights activists. This allowed developing a favorable environment for educational and critical activities and discussions that supported the growth of self-organized communities and attempted to fill the gap of outdated and conservative art education. Multiple collaborating and networking projects and initiatives launched by or supported by the Rep group, like the Communities Projects or Curators Association Hudrada, to name just a few, openly stated their goal as developing socially engaged critical art in Ukraine. By early 2010s, Rep and other art groups and platforms and even institutions became a certain prototype of a civil society. They were fighting communities, as Vasil Cherepanin put it once, that dared to enter the zone of political exclusion and othering. Often self-organized, they proclaimed personal as political and served as a simultaneously educational laboratory, discussion clubs, critical body, collective art manager, and a group of activists standing up for various urgent social issues. By constantly renegotiating and re-articulating the common and shared spaces, strategies, and languages, they question accepted power relations, providing a supportive environment for growing of a new virus. The policy of the small steps also had its certain downside. The influence was limited and mostly did not go further than the negotiated limits of the communities, while the communities were very hermetic, often using social criticism as a tool of dismantling, but not renegotiating, working against, but not towards the new social contract. The fact that artistic communities were focused on growing the new art scene, on creating environments of solidarity of fellows, ended up excluding non-professional audiences from the process and facing the phenomenon of a local art without a local audience. However, political emancipation of artistic practices was slowly opening the doors for the political emancipation of Ukrainian society in general. It provided, even if limited, possibilities to articulate and practice solidarity, participatory approaches, activism, address the issues of minorities and discrimination, power relations and hierarchies, freedoms and confrontations, censorship and open dialogues. Slow and embattled changes in vocabulary prepared for the changes in social optics and thus for the changes in practices of social interactions. And the key, or kind of the high point of that, of course, were the protests of the winter of 2013-14, known as Euromaidan. It was literally the virus of the commons and the small steps that in a way mutated to the next level. It was the period when small steps, small, very literal actions like cutting sandwiches or fetching firewoods or setting up the field hospitals that laid the ground for a different kind of society based on the common fight, but at the same time on the joint care and solidarity. Maidan as a movement of mass mobilization and emancipation set the art free from the constant need to fight for political agenda, since everything has become highly political. On the other hand, rapidly accelerating dynamics of political and geopolitical changes in the country and the region made the artists face several challenges. The unsurmountable force of the new and perpetually changing Ukrainian context squeezed between the newly acquired political freedoms and the devastating war in the East, between the optimism of reclaiming the country in many senses and the daily rise of the death toll set the framework that was near impossible to avoid. When real action is valued far more than the symbolic one, is it still possible to be relevant to the moment and free in the choice of narratives? Is there a way to acknowledge social expectations and even demands for addressing burning political issues and still be critical, non-linear, staying beyond the thin edge of propaganda? In comparison to the previous decade, there was at least one significant difference. Before 2014, the fighting communities were mainly trying to address universal democratic issues long overdue in Ukraine, such as gender rights, inequality, body politics, urban spaces, social cohesion, and many more. These attempts were based on the local context, but still trying to catch up with a more universal, largely Western art discourse. After 2014, however, it was a local context that came into focus. And here, I think from the different side, I'm also addressing the documentary turn that was mentioned by Svitlana and Jessica before. Maidan marked the major re-subjectification of the country previously absent on both international and paradoxically local mental maps. There were stories to be discovered and re-articulated. New narratives and new forms of representation were called for. Culture became the space for mutual learning and unlearning of various actors and peoples. Artists and activists were opening cultural hubs and forums all over the country, but especially in the East. They engaged in decentralized actions. They created residencies and exchanges. They were literally trying to stitch the country together through cultural and artistic action. In the country submerged in the identity struggles and memory wars, many artists continued what started during the months of Maidan, documenting and empowering the voices of the other, telling the stories of those unseen and disempowered, articulating history not as a politically curated linear narrative serving the purpose of nation building, but as a layered and conflicting array of forgotten stories. There are many of such stories to be uncovered, and I will just very briefly mention a few names in this chapter. So the stories of the people internally displaced by the war, as in works of Lia and Andrii Dostlieva, who are here with us today, of the people still living or used to be living on the occupied territories and along the line of conflict, daily affected by the atrocities of the fight, like in the works of Alevtina Kahidze and Alexei Radinsky, of the people that are not fitting to the mainstream of identity struggles, or the ones bearing stigmas of unarticulated past, like in the works of Nikita Kadan. Infamous decommunization laws created an impetus for more profound research in the history of the 20th century, as well as for inquiries of what can come in place of the fallen monuments of the past, as in the works of, for example, David Chichkan or Yevhen Nikiforov, or many others. Attention to local stories and local histories remapped the cultural geographies of the country. While the main political call was towards the unity in the face of Russian aggression and escalating hybrid war, and nowadays even unfortunately a real potentiality of real war, artists did keep articulating multiplicity and diversity of voices and identities, pointing towards knowledge gaps and intolerances. And as a very, very quick 1-minute conclusion, I know I'm a bit longer than I was supposed to be. I was just wanted to go back to the idea of the virus and the image of the virus and the story of the pandemic, and just mention that, you know, the pandemic, which took much longer time than was sort of ever expected in the beginning, did create a radical shift in both understanding and perception of the virus and what the virus is and what the virus can do. It brought fear and isolation, social atomization, and closed borders. Early illusions of global equality in the face of the omnipresent and omnipotent virus gave the space to an acute realization of global inequalities in the ways the care and protection were available. The few things stayed shared, however, and I want to have a very short quote from Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, who wrote during his first experiences of pandemic, that this fundamental vulnerability is the very essence of humanity. In the global run for new discoveries, technological and political revolutions, this vulnerability and fragility seem to be lost. The quarantine grounded humanity, compelled us to pay attention to ourselves and others, and brought up the need for care, solidarity, support, and mutual understanding. Art as a daily practice of attention and care, voicing and articulating, creating communities, and practicing solidarity. Art as an evidence of the fundamental vulnerability of each and everyone's diverse experiences, hopefully is a new virus that still needs to infect societies and hopefully can cause profound and irreversible changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kateryna. And I'm sure we will have some time to go back and talk a little bit more about those key concepts and notions that you mentioned in your talk. And I believe we have 2 more presentations, Lia Doslima and Andrii Dostliev. Who would like?
Well, it's more of a belief for me.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you
We
hear?
present together.
So I will start briefly, hope you can see the screen, with a presentation of our practice and who we are in general. We both come from Eastern Ukraine, and we were active as artists before 2014, but we were not dealing with memory. It only started after the war broke off, a quite natural way, I suppose. This is one of our works that deals with memory and with Eastern Ukraine. This is the image from the cover of the book by Svitlana. And it comes from a project called Fairy Castles of Donetsk. It was commissioned for an exhibition in the Stetsky Arsenal in Kyiv in 2018. And for the project, we asked people who lived in Donetsk in the 1990s to record their memories, their experience of living there, that were connected to a certain place in the city. And then we sort of reconstructed these places using archival photos and Lego bricks to make sort of semi-fictional castles that resemble the real building that is mentioned in the story. It was shown at several exhibitions, and there are more stories than I show you here. But it's just one of the examples of our works related to memory. It is a sort of an attempt to reconstruct the lost city together with the memories that come with this loss. And it's in a way a continuation of our early curatorial project that was for the first time exhibited in Izolyatsiya in Kyiv in 2016. It was called Reconstruction of Memory, and I hope Lia will tell more about the project.
Yeah, can you hear me well? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So Reconstruction of Memory was our first large-scale project about traumatic experience, which gathered together artists who were either expelled from their homes by Russian occupation, or like us, left without a chance of return. With certain questions. For example, what can those who were forcibly displaced and lost everything do with their familial memory? And is there a way to restore the lost items that once enabled storytelling about the past? Family albums, heirlooms, memorabilia, by speaking about their loss at the very least. So we invited artists who had a first-hand experience of occupation and loss to recreate somehow what was lost. It was an impossible task, obviously, but it was needed to start the public discussion in Ukraine about the topic. And in bringing the issue of internally displaced persons' familial memory lost due to war and occupation into public discussion, we face this social unpreparedness of seeing those people as something other than silent recipients of charitable aid. Paradoxically, the loss of homes leads to a huge social group of people being classified as those without agency, and therefore unable to form personal statements and be rightful actors in social discussion. During the first years after the beginning of the war, internally displaced persons were only spoken in the context of aid. And that means aid in satisfying the most basic needs, like finding a home, a job, clothes, kindergarten places for children. But what could be done about the memory of the social group? So we addressed this issue in our Reconstruction of Memory project. Could you please show us the previous slide? Yeah, your work. Yeah, thank you. So on this slide, you can see a picture from Andrii Dostliev's project, which is called Occupation. he created a ghost family album, reconstructing from memory his family photos in the way he remembered them. Because the original archive, the same as for many people who left, was lost due to occupation as albums remained in Donetsk. This reconstruction is pretty inaccurate and bears visible traces of his artistic interventions. Thus, the wound left by occupation, which is also, as I mentioned, the name of the project, became visible in the frame of the artistic work. We began to work on the project in the summer of 2015, and then it seemed that the work would end at any moment and everything would go back to normal soon. And feelings of dismay and being lost caused by the very fact that war was suddenly not just some abstract fact from school history book, but parts of our personal story seemed to be a dominant mindset during that period for us, which is also very relevant now. Some of the artists we invited eventually declined. The events were too recent and traumatic to find enough distance from them to create artwork. Also, together with Yulia Po, we created a symbolic Crimean beach. Yeah, this one. The south coast of Crimea has been the traditional place to spend summer vacations for people from all over Ukraine, like for generations. It would be a challenge to find someone who had never been in Crimea. The beaches of the south coast, as we all know, are covered with pebbles, which people would often bring home as a souvenir from Crimea. So such a pebble became a document of summer vacations, just as pictured in this image, for example. And now, after the annexation, such souvenirs obtain additional symbolic meaning and become a fragile link between acquired and lost, mental and physical, imaginary and eyewitnessed. So we, together with Yulia, asked friends and some random people via social media to donate some of their Crimean pebbles to us. And by gathering all the pebbles, we have repeated the path of the Crimean tourist who gathers pebbles on the beach. And by doing so, we recreated our common space of memories, but also made a physical reconstruction of the place these memories are connected to. Yeah, you can already notice that we really like to recreate and reconstruct things. Yeah, and it maybe it's worth mentioning that after the exhibition in the York Center for Contemporary Art in Prague, this installation was badly damaged during the transportation, and we think that people who made the delivery somehow damaged the package and then saw that inside were Mars pebbles, and they suspect they just threw everything away. So now the 28 kilos of Crimea are mostly lost again, like for their second time. And the transport company sent us several forms, which we had to fill in to file a complaint. And among others, there was the most obvious question: what is the estimated value of your cargo? And yeah, by the time it was super painful, but the story is a good example of the non-obviousness of the symbolic value of certain objects, because the space of remembrance that we tried to create in our exhibition, when taken out of its original context and stripped of textual description, became a mere pile of stones and mere trash. Yes, it was a painful experience, but very useful in terms of art. And then back to our beautiful book. Shortly before the pandemic, Eva Stachowska and Margaret Tully invited us to join the Communicating a Difficult Past project with our work about Holodomor, and Andrii probably will explain.
Yes, the work title is I Still Feel Sorry When I Throw Away Food. Grandma used to tell me stories about the Holodomor, and it's a sort of a visual diary that speaks about post-memory, about the Holodomor in our generation. Me and Lia, we were looking for traces of the traumatic events in our daily life, and one of the most obvious traces were different practices related to food. This feeling of shame when you throw away some leftovers, and I mean, it all comes from the stories that our grandparents used to tell us about their experiences and their survival of the Holodomor. And even though it has no logical explanation, otherwise we still have this feeling of sorrow when we have to throw away food. So we decided that we would document every bit of food that we threw away for almost 3 months. We took ink prints of the food before we threw it away and signed it and arranged it into a sort of a visual diary, which was presented in Riga at Margaret and Yeva's exhibition. It's also published as a book by Rodovit Press. I don't know, Lia, do you want to add anything? Then that's all.
Yeah, I want to add something. Yeah, and we collected 2 excess pages, tiny pieces of landscape photos, because Holodomor known because of like this famine left no traces in the landscape. Because all the burial places were like prohibited to mark and the process of commemoration started shortly before the independence. So we decided that famine left no traces in terms of places of memory. So we tried to add some unrecognizable parts of anonymous photos just to mark this. Yeah. So proves its need.
Thank you, Lia. Thank you, Andrii. I think at this point we can proceed to our Q&A session, and please submit your comments or your questions in our Q&A box. And while we're waiting for our comments or questions, I would like to go back to this notion of solidarity, which was mentioned in practically everyone's presentation. And I'm wondering what this presentation is, what this solidarity is based on, following up on your presentations as well. So what is it that unites probably the Ukrainians at this point, or what is it that you focused on when studying this concept of solidarity, and that somehow contributed to this sense of unity? And I would guess that it would be different if we look at different decades. In the 90s, it would probably be something different from what we have, for example, at this moment.
Well, if you mean solidarity inside Ukraine, or solidarity between Ukrainian and Baltic countries that we try to present in this book, I think they go through the axis of history, of identity, of relation to memory. and the ways of interpreting this memory. So I think what unites and what divides at times is precisely these notions, and these are the key notions for research. If we speak about Ukrainian society, of course, there is also this notion of the external threat that goes kind of visibly through all art that was created recently. And precisely the solidarity, I think, in that case is based in the idea of resistance or resilience, or in some way challenging this threat through artistic means, because art is also the means of expression of certain position in the society, and it gives voice to the society.
I would also add to this concept. Oh, am I frozen? No, okay,
No.
now I'm not. Sorry. I will also add to the concept of solidarity in gendered terms is about individuation and being okay with not fitting into a category and challenging the status quo. And I think that even implicit in the idea of solidarity is a celebration of difference. We need solidarity because I have a different position than you do, but we can agree and support one another on some common goal. I think that a lot of critical approaches throughout this volume naturally celebrate being an individual. That's what artists are doing, and that's what art is about. And in the time of mass information and rise of, far right groups globally and nationalism globally, taking concepts of mass identity to an extreme, I think that solidarity becomes a way of anti-politics, of stepping outside of having to join any mass movement, but still being linked to other individuals who don't want to, be swept into the drama of politics uncritically. That there is a kind of, I guess, mutual support or care network. Also, as Kateryna mentioned, the importance of care and caring for others, and having that be also part of this concept of solidarity, I think is really important.
Thank you, Jessica.
I also wanted to make a very short comment, because I was talking about solidarity a lot in my presentation, and I think, a bit sort of continuing what Jessica was now saying, that the solidarity often comes as a motivation to fill in certain gaps. Ukraine is an interesting, in a way, paradoxical case where the lacking of certain system, like the lacking of procedures and rules being set, or support system networks being set there, creates this possibility. I mean, it's a challenge, but also constant kind of possibility to fill them in through the self-supporting, self-organized solidarity networks. And interesting enough that it was the case in the early 2000s, as I was talking about the artistic groups that were basically filling in the gaps of the institutional network, of the education, of management and curatorship, of supporting each other, and many, many more. And later on, closer to our times, it's a bit mutates and becomes more widely less artistic oriented, but more kind of social oriented solidarity, because the gaps are becoming more multiple. And if we talk about the documentary tour and this need of telling the stories, making the stories visible, supporting the other, kind of highlighting the multiplicity of others, it's also to a certain extent a result that the system that should have been there, the educational system, also the art institutional system that should have been there in place supporting this, is literally not, or it's like it's getting there, but it's still, you know, there's still a long way to go. So this is in a way a paradox of when something missing creates an opportunity to create something different on different level.
Yeah, this idea of solidarity and care made me think about Žadan's novel *The Orphanage*, where there is also this appeal to just care about others on a private level, but also that private level will somehow develop into the collective level as well. Thank you for your comments. And we have a question from Hiroaki Kuromiya, a question for Lia and Andrii. Thank you for your contribution. Can you say a few words, if you know anything, about how art in general is doing in the occupied territory of the Donbass?
I would say that unfortunately I have no information about it because we have currently no contact with anyone who is still there. So unfortunately nothing.
So there was some echo. So you do not have any information at this point, right? There was some echoing. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I observed a profile of like art museum, its current state in Donbass, and they present very poor art, unfortunately, and like aesthetic means and also conceptual means. It's really somehow it felt bad even to talk about it. I would say so. So like about someone who can be critical or who can reflect in their art. Like in current situation, we know nothing.
Thank you, Lia. Andrii?
Well, I can add that sometimes we get some bits of information coming from the occupied side, and they seem to have some sort of photography or fine art exhibitions by local photographers and painters, but it's pretty basic, I would say, and I don't think anything significant is happening there now. I don't even know any artist who remains there and keeps working. So as far as I can tell, not much is going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just a follow-up on your presentation, Andrii and Lia, I really appreciate that image with red stitches and with a picture that is somehow attached to another picture. And for me, it's very, very symbolic, and I would say very, it has a lot of meanings. To some extent, it can be associated with some wound which is covered with a patch. On the other hand, it's some memory that is attached somehow to a different memory or to a different block of memory, but it's still not blended. And how we blend these memories and how we make this memory of the past part of the present is also probably a big question right now for Ukraine in general. Well, if you would like to comment more on that image, please do. Or if you would like to comment on this current relationship for the Ukrainians with memory, so please comment on this issue as well. So what is memory for the Ukrainians? And yes, we talk about how memory is represented or how memory is worked through on some artistic level or through some artistic representations. But the topic of memory is also very popular today, and on the one hand, it's because of this new field which very vibrantly developed over the last 20-30 years, but on the other hand, because these questions are pressing and because this experience somehow has to be worked and somehow has to be blended into the current moment and into the current understanding of the past, and in order to build the future as well. So Andrii, would you like to comment on that image with the red stitches?
Well, this is this became somehow probably the most famous image from the series. It was never intended to, I didn't like it particularly, but everybody else seems to like it. So yeah, it just follows me everywhere. And in a way, it was an attempt to recreate the photos from my own album. It was a photograph of my uncle, one of his first photos when he got the camera at our old house. And I mean, the effort is obviously fruitless. You cannot recreate photos from your album using somebody else's photos. So it had to be crude because there was no way to make it not crude. So I went with like roughly cut images, sewn together, glued together, painted over, to highlight this impossibility of restoring this memory the way it was, to recreate it without scars on it.
Yeah, thank you, Andrii. So maybe we can move to the second part of my question about this relationship with memory in Ukraine.
Yeah, maybe I can say something. I think we have to be now living in this kind of, and I think we have to be, we as artists, so I came from anthropology background, so we have to be really careful not to exclude some like creating these, and so for example that's why one social group was largely ignored, and I would say that now somehow it's still happening, because for example when we saw and we are facing this new threat from Russia, I saw very few examples of asking people with actually this experience of packing stuff, moving under pressure, to some new place. It was like we are facing something really new, and this was never happened to us before. So it was like, I think we have to be really careful, and as artists, we have this opportunity to create a space for dialogue, to some kind of discussion, and I think somehow we, with our project, somehow can achieve that. Yes.
Thank you, Lia. Who would like to go next with a comment?
Oh, I just got such a thought that actually when we speak about memory and we speak about contemporary situation, and then we speak about 2014 and the beginning of the war in Ukraine, referring to it as a current situation, is not the current situation anymore. It's already part of the memory, traumatic memory, because the situation has changed enormously in the last 8 years, and we see the outcomes that actually the situation now somehow echoes the situation of 2014, but is not the same. And probably the artistic response when it will be at this time to this current tension, it will be already different, a different level of interpretation, and maybe different focus of the subjects that the artist would select for their work. And I think, for example, from my research of both documentary and archival material in artistic work, is precisely the important point, like to distinguish between what is documentary and what is archival, because instantly everything becomes archival as soon as it happened, So yeah, just a thoughts on this topic. And I wanted also to add that we discussed with Andrii and Lia recently many of these issues surrounding the topics of memory and belonging and displacement for an upcoming text that I hope soon will be published in the October journal. And it will be, I think, the first text about Ukrainian art ever published in October journal. So I look forward also to this kind of expanded discussion already transferred to other media of communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like Lia pointed out, this memory is kind of new for us, but on the other hand, it's not new at the same point, because our grandparents lived through probably a similar experience. But what's interesting about, for example, my grandparents, they never talked about anxiety during the Second World War. And my question is why they didn't talk about this anxiety. And I'm sure there was a lot of fear, anxiety, and they experienced probably something similar to what we're experiencing right now. But the question remains why I didn't hear those stories. And I think that it's somehow tied into this ideological pressure where they just didn't feel comfortable and they didn't feel safe to talk about those experiences openly, because what we remember, what I remembered as a child that from those stories that shared with me was the story of victory, was story of some glory, but not story of some suffering and not story of some victims. And I think it also resonates with this idea that Lia just mentioned, that we have to be careful about how we talk about these memories and how we keep this space open to probably different opinions, to different approaches, and to different stories and narratives as well.
I will mention something because I'm the only contributor of this volume who is from North America, and my association with memory is through different generations in my family that immigrated from Europe to New York and then up to the Midwest at the end of the 19th century and fought in World War II as American soldiers in Italy and Japan. And memory for me is lost, actually. And I think for a lot of diaspora communities, and I wouldn't really call myself a member of the diaspora because I grew up speaking Spanish as my second language in a suburb of Los Angeles. So I had to reconstruct completely any kind of root or connection to Eastern Europe. And I had to learn Ukrainian as an adult. And I think for many in North America, these artists and these stories are a way of us reconstructing our families and reconstructing our connections to Ukraine and to Eastern Europe. So it's valuable because out of the art, we can pull more universal experience and relate and explain histories that we don't remember ourselves, but maybe our grandparents did. So in terms of the national contexts in which Svitlana also has presented work in Mexico City, I've read some of those texts of the reception of work from artists who are making art about experiences on the front line in Donbass. Within the texts by Mexican scholars, there's a lot of universal experience that is shared across borders, and it makes the work, I think, even more powerful. So I'm curious and excited to see how these texts here in this volume travel and what kind of reception is unfolded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for your comment, which made me think of my conversation with Svitlana, which I had just a few months ago, I believe. And during that conversation, Svitlana, you mentioned the story about teaching one of the episodes connected with the contemporary Ukrainian history, and one of your listeners in your university, without probably knowing much about Ukraine, made a comment that this story really resonated with her because she had some similar traumatic experience. So would you just comment a little bit on that story one more time?
Yes, it was actually the part of the project of the front line. It was a panel discussion where we invited various speakers from Ukraine, from Britain, from Mexico, and the audience was it was very diverse audience. And once after this panel discussion, where we focus precisely on these topics of violence in the east of Ukraine related to the Russian invasion, she approached me and she said that it was for her very touching, and at the same time it made her recall some traumatic moments when she was living in Sinaloa in the north of Mexico, and there were shootings occurring there often related to all this narco-traffickers war with police and all this conflict. And then she needed to move to Mexico City from there because it was very difficult to stay, because literally they needed to hide under the table in the office almost every day because they were shooting behind their windows. And that touched her so much, like this idea of universality of danger, universality of threat, and universality of violence in an armed conflict. But this is something precisely in that project I was criticized about, because many people were asking me, how can you discuss violence in this particularly universal way? Because how avoiding overgeneralization. Because, for example, there is other example of here in Mexico of the massacre of students in 1968, when the government shot the protester students, over 300 of them, in Totoliko, in the residential district of Totoliko. And there is kind of always it's very prompting to make this connection with the events of Euromaidan, when the government attacked the students in the beginning of the events, and then already when there was this event with more than 100 people who were killed. But always we need to consider, of course, that the context presented is always different. So speaking about all these memory processes and the ways people remember the events, also we need to mind that these memories, they're shaped by particular social conditions and cultural conditions, and these conditions might differ. And that's something that makes it difficult for comparative research. That's one of the biggest challenges. For example, in history of art, comparative history of art, this is the challenge. How to make everything not overgeneralized, but sensitive to its own environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really appreciate your volume, because as you pointed out, it helps create this niche for Ukrainian art in what today we define as global mental maps, or we can also say global memory maps, because again, as some scholars today note, the situation that we have with Russia today is probably the consequence of the fact that Ukraine wasn't remembered on this global map, and Ukraine wasn't known very well on this mental map. And as one of the scholars pointed out, what we have today is the failure not only diplomacy but also of Western imagination. I believe it was Anne Applebaum who pointed out that it's because the West wasn't prepared to better understand Ukraine, because Ukraine wasn't known. In spite of the fact that Ukraine has thousands of years in its history and its culture. But again, thank you so much for your volume, and thank you so much for your contributions today into this conversation, and for creating this niche on the global memory or mental map. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for attending our talk, our book launch today. Information about upcoming events will be posted on UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and for future recorded events, please subscribe to our channel. Again, thank you for attending our book launch today.